Yeah. All right. We're still working on going live. I'm gonna do this. Come on. Are we sort of? Oh, now it's echoing. Are we okay now? Yes? No?
I can hear you. It's
Are um damn it. Let me shut some things down. Not the page I wanted. Okay. Okay. Welcome to Weekly Marx. 5th of October. We're going to review some points from the CCSGJ Andy Higginbottom lectures, lecture 7. And I'm going to review some of it, but make a side note. The one thing in his particular lecture is that in this section, he talks about Distrut Tracy or Distrut whatever. Anyway, French guy who also gives us, at least in the modern sense, but not in an identical semantic way, the word ideology. Now, ideology exists actually much earlier, but in the sort of Enlightenment context, and since Higginbottom brings the damn thing up, it's interesting to see how it fits in here. But Higginbottom himself, as I recall, never mentions how Tracy is also the person for whom the modern 19th and 20th century, well, 20th century concepts of ideology at least have their sort of source. They're much different by the time we finally get to the middle of the 20th century, but I know this is very pedantic, but in case you want to sort of dominate in a cocktail conversation, I suppose this will do. Anyway, so I came across this very small article on it's sort of an overview from Tracy to Marx, and here's a quote from Marx on idealism, which is where ideology sort of comes from, in the sense, in the Hegelian sense, that we're talking about things that are sort of metaphysical, that aren't you know that exist in some ways just in language or in thought. And so that's kind of where what ideology refers to. In the modern post-war sense, ideology is a broad phenomenon. It exists. I personally consider every religion to be an ideology because it is. It's a system of belief. It's largely metaphysical. It has implications for an afterlife or some other kind of transcendental move. And so, in that sense, it's ideology, and people operate according to that ideology. So, for example, during the football games today, speaking of football, the super PACs or the political action committees, the right wing ones, are running an ad that implies, it does not state it, but it implies that Kamala Harris will offer transgender surgeries on demand. Now, that's the core message. What they're quoting from is stuff when she was Attorney General of California, and there was litigation, and there has been litigation for decades by transgendered inmates who want to have reassignment, gender reassignment surgery. So that it happened. It's been on the scene before she got there, but they're trying to misquote that, and of course it's on during the UCLA Penn State game because part of the audience is in Pennsylvania, and therefore it's about swing states. So I know that went way far over, but it is an ideological position, one that is completely distorted, and yet has capital, social capital. So anyway, that's aside. Marx says no specific difference distinguishes German idealism from the ideology of all other peoples. The latter ideology also considers the world as governed by ideas, that ideas and concepts are determining principles, that certain ideas constitute the mystery of the world accessible to philosophers. And you can see how that can apply to religion. It also suggests a certain language kind of position where if you take a certain 19th century position, concepts are, well, in my little brain, concepts are finite and ideas are infinite. Just as in language, you have all these words. Words are, can represent ideas, whatever, but you have grammatical rules, which are conceptual. I mean, things only make sense when you sort of put them together in the right order, right? That's syntactic order, right? You gain more semantic, that is, conceptual or cognitive meaning when you put things together in the proper way. And without going through a whole deal, Noam Chomsky at all, that's kind of, for me, that's the easy way to think about it, that there is actually a finite way in which we can organize our world rationally, and that we've an infinite number of combinations of sentences and whatever that we can create, some of which make sense, others not so much. So I hunted around and I found an article on, needless to say, Marxist approaches to linguistics, but it's really less about Marx so much as it is trying to work through the ideological question. So it's a brief introduction to a complete issue of a journal called Language Science. So anyway, for Marx and Engels, language was both practical consciousness that exists for others, and for that reason alone, it really exists for me personally as well. That's quoting Marx, and a principal vehicle for the ideological forms in which people fight out the contradictions of material life, because that's kind of the whole deal. I mean, how is it that we express our class antagonisms or hassle people or hate people or love people, etc.? How could such a position not matter to linguistics? Well, there is therefore no explicit theory of language or communication in Marx or Engels. The pair demonstrated, at least in outline, how an essentially logoid, is referring to logos, the logos tradition of linguistic thinking as opposed to pathos and whatever. Anyway, could be adapted and remodeled for settling accounts with previous philosophical, historical, and scientific perspectives, as well as pushing the boundaries of linguistic inquiry towards an interactional or transactional conception of language and communication. Unless you think that's unimportant, that's actually Chomsky's whole deal. I mean, aside from his politics. In the main, however, questions of language were largely taken on through the more practical problems and tasks of political and professional life, as well as in everyday living, finding a new language in which to accurately formulate the decisive conceptual or theoretical underpinnings of communism, and a new language of politics to address socialist colleagues and working people. You can actually see this operative in, Soviet Union, for example. Journalistic activity for a range of international publications, commentaries on literary works and political tracts, translations of foreign works, and commentaries on the problems and issues and translation of their own work. So this is just the general translation issue, as discussed by Gramsci and Benjamin, who are really important for kind of cultural theories or cultural studies relative to Marxism. The assimilation of writings on politics and economics of different historical periods and nations and communities in a range of languages, including Russian. How else could theory get a hold of working people and become a material force for revolutionary transformation other than through this prodigious, creative, linguistic, and communicational labor through which collective agency becomes consciously organized and mobilized in struggle? Note that communicational labor and collective agency are something I talked about yesterday. The idea that, you need to sort of because I was talking about collective action in reference to the kind of social relations that we have. You need to figure out, well, um, you need to have a sense of who's in charge or who's doing whatever, how is action conceived of, and is individual action, how is it seen relative to collective action? Anyway, so I'm sorry for that little sideline there, but it is important to note that there's actually a literature for this, and in the pre-Stalinist Soviet Union, there's what's called a humanist tradition, a humanist Marxism that, as we've seen referred to in other times, that has various elements, and it seems like a logical conclusion that there would be at some moment linguistic interests. And in the Soviet Union, people like Vygotsky and Voloshinov, these are actually important people. Vygotsky is actually very important for psychology of a certain developmental psychology of a certain type that represents a kind of humanist approach to psychology, and is actually very popular at certain places in the United States. Others, not so much. But it is a certain idea about how children learn, the sort of cognitive understanding and interrelations, and it ultimately relates to language, and it ultimately gets to semiotics, but that's a whole nother story. Okay, back to what we're going to talk about today. The conclusion one can draw from this survey of the history of meaning the word ideology, this is from that article I was mentioning, from 1796 to 1867, can only be ironical. The word that was to supplant metaphysics and denote, as opposed to connote, denote something more scientific and positive, and undergone a metamorphosis in the empire, the French Empire, Empire, due to its political connotations and to what Napoleon of the brandy, considered, in spite of Tracy, its metaphysical character. By the time Marx used the word, it had already acquired a pejorative sense. So you need to get a sense that when Marx is looking at it, he's only read perhaps one of Tracy's books, and it's the same one, I would assert, that informs Andy Higginbottom in Lecture 7 of what we've of what we've been looking at in terms of lectures. So, but it was specifically Marx's reading of Tracy's Economics and the Elements of Ideology, which led him to associate the word with the bourgeois class interests, and that despite the high pedigree of nobility of the Comte de Tracy. And the point that this particular person, Kennedy, who writes this article, Emmett Kennedy, what he suggests is that, well, Marx read a little bit of this, and Marx actually liked a lot of it, but he also saw that it really didn't relate very well to class positions because, this guy, Tracy, he's a Comte, right? He's writing from a position of the nobility, and so therefore represents largely sort of a bourgeois perspective on this, and so therefore not so useful for a theory of ideology, which gets picked up. And I know you don't care about this, but in the 60s and 70s, this is where Althusser goes, right? This is where like the key elements of a certain type of approach to value form and Marx and blah blah blah, post-war Marxian thought, it goes strictly to this ideology question, and a lot of ink gets spilled. And so this just gives you the background of it, that Marx looked at it and said, well, sort of okay, but I don't think we can have a theory of ideology. And I say this because I had to teach for a whole damn semester a ideology course, so that's why it's eluded my little brain. All righty. So there are 25 slides. I'm not going to yammer through the 25 slides, although I'm going to review them. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, and I will, of course, at a certain moment, look at the specific reference to Tracy in relative to ideology that Higginbottom doesn't mention. But what I want to do is review from a I've included the links to Ed George's work on reading Marx, more specifically reading the exact chapters that Higginbottom is reading, and to give you a slightly different perspective on, and it's not different in terms of oppositional, just simply a different kind of perspective on the same thing. From Ed George's point of view, which is a little bit more directed in a specific kind of direction. Let's just say that this is, I would assert that this is useful and that it helps supplement. And I've done this before to Higginbottom to accompany the Ed George total notes that he's done for every chapter of Capital. And it's a very useful document. I mean, other people have tried to do it and then they kind of get tired and or else they don't like the math. And Ed George does the whole thing. He even does the damn math. So to me, the arithmetic, it's just more useful because it's complete, or as complete in English as we'd like it. So anyway, the whole overall point that I'll give you now is that what Higginbottom is trying to tell us is that Marx is onto the place where he's trying to figure out, Department 1 and Department 2 are elements of a larger sense of how we build capital, and that it is social, that is, people are involved, and that despite the fact that it is something more abstract called capital, and it is an abstract version of, sort of labor, and without using the word congealed, we can talk about in an abstract way that there are equivalents at work. And all of this fits in this larger cycle of reproduction that is called, social human reproduction. Let's put it at its most general sense. How is it that people survive, reproduce over generations? This is an anthropological notion underlying the whole damn thing. Is that how does the whole system move forward? And we see various ways in which we can talk about this. More specifically, and as I mentioned in prior lectures, the idea is that it is the dynamics of the system, that is the motion of the system, the larger dynamic equilibrium that moves everything forward. And what Marx is trying to do is say, well, what portion of this is consumption, what portion of this is production, and his goal in these couple of chapters is to critique Adam Smith, who says, well, there must be a period where everything gets consumed and then we start again. Well, what Marx finally gets to at the end of all of this, arm waving, is that no, it doesn't go back to zero. Rather, it's continuously building on itself, which is tough for people like Smith to sort of accept, because he's sort of taking on this certain idea that, well, the period's got to end at some point. Well, no, and I think that's where Marx comes in. Marx says, it's all uneven. It is, as I've suggested, it's a kind of nested sets. It's like something happens, something else happens, and you need to sort of accommodate the idea that it is constantly moving, and that the fact that it's constantly moving doesn't mean that it's irrational or that it's random. It just simply that it is dynamic, and that we have to assume that structural things can't be static, that you have to sort of see the structure as it kind of flows. And, Marx is thinking of this with all due respect, in a kind of Hegelian way, that the dialectic, in effect, is not two periods or 4 periods or 8 periods or whatever. It's, just moves. And anytime you start dividing it up into periods, it's fine, from a certain empirical point of view, but you need to get this bigger sense of how all these things sort of fit together. And, how society has still managed to stay together in an evolutionary way. This goes back to the evolutionary game theory thing that I was talking about. So, this particular section, we can start at 18, even though, well, Higginbottom reviews part of that. Marx summarizes where we are in our analysis. The immediate production process of capital is the process of labor and valorization. That is, the formate is making stuff or working and also creating value. The immediate process of production, that is the P in MC, P, C prime, M prime, hopefully remembered why those are all that way and they don't really change with different Marxists. was the object of analysis of Volume 1. That is, the result of this process is the commodity product and its determining motive, the production of surplus value. So if you assume, as Marx does, that something is getting cleaved off at some point and isn't necessarily obvious to people, and that's the consciousness question. If you're just toiling away and you kind of can't tell, how am I being exploited, that's part of the problem. And Marx tries to show in absolute versus relative surplus value and all that other hand waving in Volume 1. You can see that it's happening. Sometimes you just don't notice it, and it only occurs, and this is the dynamic part, it happens at scale. This is, you could divide up your little week and say, well, okay, well, this portion of the hour got turned into surplus value. You could try and do that, but it's really a more systemic sort of thing. And that's a part of the sadness of it, is that sometimes you just don't notice when it's happening, and that's why capitalists sort of get away with stuff. The process of reproduction of capital, that is this entire general thing, also involves the process of circulation of capital. That was the key point that is being made in Vol.II, is that you produce stuff and then it gets exchanged. It's always getting exchanged, but that it also circulates. And that model that people like Tracy and a bunch of Kane think about, oh, maybe it's more like the body. The blood moves around in these tubes and stuff. But it's not so much, and blood doesn't just run around in tubes and stuff. It is literally its own, imagine blood as a kind of organ, with all due respect. Or more precisely, the place of this circulation in the reproduction of capital, this process of the constant repetition of the cycle of capital, of its perpetual reemergence as productive capital. That's where the blood system sort of is a useful example, is conditioned by its transformations in a cyclical movement. At the same time, the constant repetition of the production process is a condition for transformation of capital in the sphere of circulation. So to make this hopefully as simple as possible, Donald Trump keeps repeating the same crap, and often it's a lie, and he keeps reproducing it. But I mean, he repeats it. It's iterated, and what it does for certain people who are simply, sponges for this, which is a bad analogy, perhaps, all these SpongeBobs out there. But the fact is, they just sort of soak it up and don't apply any kind of critical emphasis on it. It just seems, well, it's there. It's, it's the fish in water, etc. So, and then there's certain other people who kind of like get out of, well, let's not torture that metaphor. At the same time, we have to take account of the fact that each individual capital forms a fraction of the total social capital. So that's what I've been talking about. This big thing here is total social capital. People doing stuff, making stuff, and reproducing themselves and sharing stuff. The problem, of course, is that you start transforming into money and blah, 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 and good stuff happens and bad stuff happens. The movement of the social capital is made up of the totality of movements of these autonomous fractions, the turnovers of the individual capitals. Recall that a while back we were talking about the issue, and this is why Vol.II is important, is because it talks about turnover. That is, through each kind of moment, and these are not absolute divisions, but, there's a time of turnover. And the turnover is not identical to the circulation. It's sort of like a smaller version of, whatever is happening. And so you have that big movement, that is this larger reproduction cycle, is the aggregation of all these little turnover activities. That is a turnover in a firm, or a turnover in a market, or a turnover in an activity. A train does, gets you to some place. It's not making much of a profit, but it's really part of it really is important for getting everything else to sort of move properly. As we saw this week, when the value of the supply chain got saved, at least for a couple of months until they renegotiate or whatever, get it worked through, is the longshoremen's union. is not going on strike, or they went on strike for like 36 hours or something. Um, Very important, and one hopes that it has no negative effect on the election. Anyway, chapter 19. You see how fast we got through? Former presentations of the subject. Despite the title of the chapter, its contents almost exclusively refer to what Marx called Adam Smith's dogma. The widely held classical political economic view that the price of commodities, and hence that of the total social product, which is part of total social capital. Remember, product and consumption are part of this bigger thing. It's entirely resolved into revenue. This is Smith's dogma, into wages, profits, and rent, which is the thing that we were talking about yesterday relative to the Hudson stuff. It's not all wages, profit, and rent. And in fact, it can be manipulated in a variety of problematic ways, mystified, as it were, and stolen, or, whatever. And that's why financial capital, even though it includes constant capital, it also has a shit ton of variable capital. As Marx wrote to Engels in 1863, when he was working on a draft of materialist form of part of Vol.II, this is, Marx writing to Engels, that according to Adam Smith, the natural price, problematic concept, or necessary price, is composed of wages, profit, that is interest. Remember, we're talking about interest rates and levels in the Hudson book, rent, and is thus entirely resolved into revenue. Nearly all economists, of course, this is the 19th century, have accepted this form. According to this, society would have to start afresh without capital every year. So that's the point I've been making, is that through this entire thing that Higginbottom is talking about, the critique of Smith is that Smith, wants to makes the math work. And so, there's got to be an end to the accounting period. There are ends to accounting periods. It's just that stuff gets carried over. It always does. And Smith would like it to be nice and clean, but so would Ricardo. And Marx says, can't do it that way. I mean, you could sort of make it contingent and sort of measure stuff, and that's kind of what he does in Volume 2. But ultimately, it's more, a lot of moving parts, and, you sort of want to get a handle on the fact that even if you sort of have a certain handle on certain constant or relative things, that it's part of this much bigger deal. And yes, as imprecise as it must be, it is what reality is. Marx's famous reproduction schemes, which appear in the following two chapters, are based in good part on his refutation of this dogma. Okay, so this explains all the hand waving. It's essentially trying to explain the difference between a static and a dynamic version of what constitutes reproduction. Quenet's number two, Quenet's conception of reproduction. Marx begins by complimenting Quenet for showing in his Tableau économique how the numberless individual acts of circulation are grouped together. Remember, I talked about aggregation as a mass circulation between major economic classes of society that are defined by their functions. Quenet and the physiocrats are interested in trying to get an accounting system together, but they also know that this is a big deal, and they're big masses of people that are differentiated by class for a variety of reasons. Part of it is ownership, part of it is power, variety of other things. A bearer of old capital value reappearing in the same natural form, i.e., he comes to grips with the main question that reproduction includes the reproduction of constant capital. So this is making a point about, fixed and circulating and constant and variable. And remember, I've gone through this before, and there's a subtlety in the difference between the two concepts that, may or may not be hugely relevant, but worth arguing. It is with respect to this that Smith represents a regression. That is, the narrowness of Smith's conception lies in his failure, Adam Smith's failure, to see what Quenet had already seen, namely the reappearance of the value of the constant capital in a renewed form. In other words, you got machines, and sometimes they don't wear out in the time period, and you got to sort of work through that. Why is it that we still have the damn machine? We're not using enough. We can still use it for another couple of years or whatever. Smith doesn't want to deal with that, when in fact the reality is just that's just what happened. But yet, from a theoretical point of view, Didn't want to come to grips with it because it looks better on paper to, talk about it. Well, we're through this period and then we move on to the next thing and blah, blah, blah. See how fast we're going, right? Chapter 20, part 1. Simple reproduction, the exchange between the two departments of production, Department 1 and Department 2. Number 2 is less production, more exchange, more consumption, etc., circulation. This chapter, along with the one that follows logically from the preceding analyses of this volume and of volume 1. The object of analysis of volume 1 was the immediate process of production, the P and MCP, C prime, M prime, the same as above. The immediate production process of capital is its process of labor and valorization, right? Working and making value, making, things worth more. The result of this process being the commodity product. That is, something happens, it gets made, goes out in the market. Volume 1 considered capitalist production abstracted from its total process of reproduction, specifically from its process of circulation. So that's the whole point, right? Volume 1 is a simplified version, and mainly because it was designed to talk to working people. Working people, they're at the point of, the tip of the spear. They're making stuff. And so if you're organizing trade labor, unions, people, doing actual work, you're going to have to address them, this is more direct. And to deal with the abstractions, this is sort of why volume 2 happens. This has been the subject of volume 2, precisely the process of circulation of capital, or more exactly, the place of this circulation in its reproduction. So, you had a front end kind of example of, stuff gets produced, it gets distributed and gets consumed. So in volume 2, Marx is talking about, the parts 2 and 3, distribution and consumption. He's trying to get through some of that. And because you don't have this massive middle class being created, consumptive middle class, he just is not emphasizing, consumption that much because, the ruling class does all that. And that's what Higginbottom is talking about, when he talks about yachts. The whole yacht discourse thing that he talks about that's kind of what he's using as a contrast. Then in part 2, we consider this cycle as a periodic one and the implications of this periodicity. Now, since the circuits, that is cycles of individual capitals, remember there's not just one capital. I mean, in the abstract, there is, yes, this one big thing called capital, but really it's a combination and aggregation of little capitals, all kinds of, financial capital, merchant capital, industrial capital, etc. Presuppose one another. We're going to consider the movement of the total social capital. So he's talking about the big thing. The movement of the social capital is made up of the totality of movements of these autonomous, that's the important word, fractions, the turnovers of the individual capital. So this repeats what we were just talking about, simply because there's always a lot of redundancy from Marx, but that's exactly what it is. These fractions don't always merge or come together. They're operating independently. It's particularly in space and time. Stuff's happening in the colonies, stuff's happening here, blah, blah, blah. Given the length of the chapter and the fact that it was compiled from different manuscripts written over a period of some years. So note that this whole mess, as we've described before, capital is a function of all of these different manuscripts. And, you have editors, Marx himself and Engels and a bunch of folks trying to get this to work properly. At the end, maybe it doesn't, but there's a lot of people, maybe even including me, trying to sort of fit this in a discourse that makes sense, particularly for the current process. I have broken it down. This is Ed George talking about, Ed George breaks it down into 3 more easily digestible parts. First part deals with the question of simple reproduction as such and introduces the notion of the 2 departments of production and that of the mechanisms and conditions of exchange between them. He refers to this as mechanisms because, it's a kind of functional thing. It sort of happens, and it's not because somebody's following a rule book necessarily, but, this just sort of operates mechanically. This follows with the idea that in the 19th century, you had these sort of mechanical views of the world. In the second part, Marx explicitly directs his critical attention to the concepts of classical political economy. This is the same classical political economy that Hudson is talking about. Just to show you that there's a through line to this, the classical political economy needs to come back that Michael Hudson talks about in his book on, uh, uh, the host, killing the host in general, and Adamson's in particular. And in the third, this is the third easily digestible part, we hope, Marx addresses the specific question of the reproduction of fixed capital, that is, like machines and resources and stuff, and consequently both changes the abstracting assumptions adopted during the rest of the chapter and more directly anticipates the subject matter of the following one, that is, expanded reproduction. So, in other words, something that's not just simply reproducing to sustain itself, but it's part of a larger system that bunches of people need to be sustained, families, classes, other things, institutions. So this first part incorporates the first 6 sections of the chapter. The second deals with sections 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, and 13. And the third, dealing with the question of fixed capital, summarizes section 11. So this is why in Higginbottom's slides, this is why you get through all these numbers. They're just the sections that move forward. So now we're on to chapter 20, part 2. See, it actually goes fairly quickly. And, I don't have to read all that Marx stuff and still cover the same point. So, number 7, variable capital and surplus value in the 2 departments. Remember, there's Department 1, production, Department 2, circulation, distribution stuff. Evidently, under conditions of a simple reproduction, the total means of consumption produced in a single production period is equal in value to the variable capital reproduced and the surplus value newly produced in the same period in both departments. That's a lot of words saying stuff gets made. Total value product, that is new value, is equal to the total value of means of consumption produced. So there is a kind of equality between Department 1 and Department 2. And so without making us too crazy in all the words, these equalities exist not because the total value of means of consumption has been produced in Department 2, but because the constant value that reappears in Department 2 is equal to the new value, that is variable capital plus surplus value, produced in Department 1. And so the whole business here of arm waving is to suggest that something doesn't end in value and then become something new, completely new. It's not completely new. There's a transfer that, when you turn over things, these are not absolute. They're kind of relative. Consequence: the product of Department 1, which breaks down into C plus V plus S, also breaks down into V plus S when considered from the social point of view. But this resolution of commodity value, that's the Adam Smith dogma, that it ends at some point, only applies to that point of the total product consisting of means of consumption, and only applies in the sense that Department 2, C plus V plus S, equals 2 V plus S plus 1 V plus S. And I know that may make you crazy what you do, the little algebraic thing, and it's about capital 2 equals the surplus value from Department 1. The algebra can lose you at certain points, but the whole point is that there's a certain continuity, that it doesn't, one period doesn't end and then the other period begins anew. That's the whole point, and I've made that already a couple times, and that's kind of the deal. Marx wanted to make that clear. Of course, he repeats it because he's doing it in a bunch of different manuscripts, and because the editors, want to sort of connect all of them, but whatever, stuff happens. Now, see, we're making a lot of progress here. Part 3, chapter 21. Marx's intentions in laying out the schemes of expanded reproduction of social capital, which are the central topic of this chapter, for all the subsequent fascination they've attracted, are not immediately transparent. Is it the case that Marx wished to paint a picture of an economy in perpetual balanced growth, of a capitalist reproduction in perpetual equilibrium? Good question. Or does he want to portray the conditions for equilibrium in social production so as to demonstrate their practical unattainability? So that's already a problematic construction, right? That on the one hand, and certain types of equilibrium theory would suggest that, that stuff's over. We start again, and that's a kind of implication in standard neoclassical stuff. Is that, well, you just got to move from one period to another period, and whatever, that stuff happens. But it's more than that. That because stuff happens, sometimes other stuff happens, like surplus value, which is what was above trying to be shown. Is that surplus value at scale is being produced at various points in here, and they're not necessarily the same quote unquote surplus value. They contribute to this larger abstraction of surplus, and particularly at scale. And scale is very important here. So the last question is: Marx painting a picture of an inevitably crisis-free capitalism or an inherently crisis-ridden one? So this is the whole point. The whole point of deciding whether you're going to follow the Marxian crisis theory, that at a certain moment, because of some cyclical change, stuff happens and it automatically destroys itself. Does it always destroy itself on a regular basis? Does it destroy itself so that the entire mode of production gets destroyed, which is sort of what's happening with a climate crisis? And that's why some people would argue that that's kind of what's going on. It's cataclysmic, and it could be as bad as, the giant meteor, whatever. In good part, Marx's inspiration for the reproduction schemes came from the impact made on him by Quenet's Tableau économique, incontestably the most brilliant conception for which political economy had up to then been responsible. In Marx's words, what Quenet wanted to portray was, and this whole paragraph is moderately important, the whole production process of capital as a process of reproduction, with circulation merely as the form of this reproductive process, and the circulation of money only as a phase in the circulation of capital. At the same time, to include in this reproductive process the origin of revenue, the exchange between capital and revenue, the relation between reproductive consumption and final consumption, and to include in the circulation of capital the circulation between consumers and producers, and in fact, similarly, between capital and revenue. And finally, to present the circulation between the two great divisions of productive labor, raw material production and manufacture, as phases of this reproductive process. So hopefully you get the sense that it's, kind of relatively simple. It's just that we have some new terms that are being thrown in here, and they're from certain points of view. Revenue is important to the capitalists. Revenue, not so much to laborers, and, for obvious reasons. And so these kind of nuances become the real way in which we describe our relationship to, as our class relationship. It does not require a too far stretch of the imagination to conceive of Marx wanting to achieve something similar. And in so doing, prominent in his mind was his critique of Adam Smith's dogma, which we've mentioned before, that the value of commodities in its totality could be resolved into revenue, that is, profit and wages. Now, the thing is, of course, if you're a worker, you're not thinking about profit. I mean, the capitalists think about it. You don't think about profit. You think about wages. And you think about revenue, it's in a personal revenue, but it's not quite the same thing, because it's a question of use and exchange again. If this were true, argued Marx, the total social product would be consumed by capitalists and workers. That's what Smith's implying. And there would be no accumulation. Society would have to start each year de novo, that is, anew, without capital. But if it were not true, if a part of the product was not consumed but accumulated, see, that's why accumulation and its social structure is really important in here, because something is getting skimmed off. Something's being accumulated. I mean, workers accumulate stuff, but the capitalists accumulate more. They always do. They have to. And in some ways, it's required. I mean, it's just built into the system. Then the problem to be solved was the apparent imbalance, the asymmetry between revenue and product, between what was consumed and what was produced. That's why we talk about production periods. We talk about depreciation and amortization and all that other stuff. How, if what was spent as revenue was necessarily less than the value of what had been produced, would that part of the product be to be accumulated be sold? So this is already asking the question, well, what's being skimmed off here? So how is it possible for the worker with his wages, the capitalist with his profit, the landowner with his rent, to buy commodities that contain not only one of these components, that is constant capital, variable capital, and surplus value, but all three? And how is it possible for the value sum of wages, profit, and rent, that is the three sources of income taken together, which are to buy the commodities which are to enter into the total consumption of the recipients of these incomes, that is sustainability. You need to take a paycheck home and get stuff to, stay alive. To contain a further additional value component on top of these three, i.e. constant capital. How can a value of 4 be bought with a value of 3? It's a little, that's sort of a dumb math there. It's just trying to emphasize the point about reproduction. Marx's expanded reproduction schemes show that capitalists are not only able to recover the constant capital component of the social product so as to continue production on the same scale, just talking about machines, at one level, but also to accumulate more of the social product as new capital, both constant and variable. So the point being made here, of course, is that you can't easily bifurcate all of these things. It just, it overlaps a lot. And the overlap is actually where the real problem occurs. It's where it always occurs. So in whatever time I just took, I covered what Higginbottom was doing, and we'll kind of brush through that so you can view Higginbottom's discussion you're on your own. But I'm going to mention in a little break here, we have 2 things coming up. Tomorrow, October 6th at 1 p.m. The Zoom link is here. It's also in Discord. Conversation with Kostas Lapavitsas on financial crises and financialization of capitalism. And there's a little video that's available at Class Unity, as well as a couple of articles, which are actually very good articles. The financialization of capital, financialized capitalism. These all relate to, these underpin, as it were, what Hudson is talking about. These are the fundamentals of the question of creating this kind of abstracted version of financialization that has destroyed the global economy, still. And similarly, on Thursday, October 10th at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time, it's a Thursday, there's a Zoom, Michael Hudson's going to show up and people will ask questions. I may even ask a question, although, who knows, the usual kind of discourse problems that will occur that I've already anticipated. Okay, so looking at the slides, where am I in terms of time? I guess I'm okay with time. Let me finish up this and then we'll get back to, reality. So we're looking at lecture 7, part 3B, advanced topics on the simple reproduction and circulation of the total social capital. This is what I just described to you in the Ed George version. So there's all of these discussions, and then the dispute trustee theory of reproduction sort of there, and it's there, and yes, it's advanced and technical, and yes, it's can be problematic, but it is fundamentally, as I've just described, a critique of Adam Smith and differentiating between means of production and means of consumption. So Department 1, Department 2. The analogy is problematic, of course, because you're using natural analogies or naturalistic analogies, and David Harvey kind of doesn't confuse the matter so much as he tries to make it easy for the reader as well. That is, how is it that stuff gets made? Stuff reproduces itself, and biology is the easiest way to explain it, for all kinds of reasons, evolution notwithstanding. So additional points that are made here, and he revives the difference between concrete and abstract labor, noting the difference, of course, between the kind of actual labor and a kind of abstracted labor that allows the formation of social value. It is just that abstraction step that is important, because people get bogged down with this idea from Vol.I that concrete labor, because it's concrete, is always material. And yeah, yes and no, because it's a bunch of things, and it's not necessarily identical, but has a structural similarity to other questions about capital. That is, that you make the distinction between concrete and abstract as an abstraction itself. Um, oh God, I'm sort of redoing an entire course I did. Anyway, so it is a kind of method. It is a question about analysis and the different levels, the nested levels, as it were, of different things. So, how is it that stuff happens? Circulation of total social capital in the commodity form, i.e., commodity capital. This whole business of the commodity form, which is what Marx begins Vol.I with, is, while it's an abstraction, it's sort of an easy way to think about all of these different things relating to what we do. That people in little factories, the Keebler elves are in their little thing there, but what they come to grips with when they poke their heads out of the little tree and talk to, elves or humans, is, well, what's actually happening? Well, cookies are being made, but there's a whole bunch of other things going on. People buy the damn things and they eat them, and other things, crazy things happen to them, which is part of the advertising, which is always amusing. That it separates Department 1 and Department 2 on the one hand. On the other hand, they're conjoined by the cookies or whatever, the buying of the cookies, which is actually more important. So anyway, so the department scheme has shifts according to not only the moment between Department 1 and Department 2, but between larger moments of going between 1 and 2. And that's the whole point of all the algebra, is to show that it's always being differentiated. There's certain unevenness, and that there also is a set of divisions going on. Things are happening, and because the commodity form itself has that kind of more variable composition, it moves back and forth between these other questions of value, and he's only using numbers as a way of trying to describe it. And also identifying, of course, without getting too heavily into it, the idea that for certain sectors, because of the way things are produced at scale, rich people get their damn yachts, whatever. So that's kind of the other deal there. And maybe I've already lost you, but anyway, the point is that stuff happens, that there's movement among these things, particularly on the issue of the critique of Smith on wages, profit, and surplus value, ultimately. And you can see that all kinds of things are going on, hence all the damn arrows, but also there are different classes of people associated with different elements. So, and workers 1 and workers 2 are the same worker, right? They're not different. There's, or they could be different, but you're just thinking of the transformation of what happens in a sort of period, a production consumption period, which is more than what happened in the Vol.I, which focuses more on production and less on distribution consumption, the number 2, the Department 2. So it's not, I would like to assert that it's not confusing. It can seem confusing with all the damn numbers, but it does require a certain set of equivalencies. And it's easier if you think about when you begin to think about money, which is also introduced here, which is part of the problem in the 21st century. In the 19th century, less of a problem, because gold's there, even though it is in and of itself a problematic element. But it seems a little bit more stable, let's put it that way. But it is equally problematic, as I mentioned about a year ago when I was talking about ships with gold with 15 billion or million of amount of gold on it sinking. But anyway, so then the Stuart Tracy, I put in the specific thing about how Tracy's version of ideology is more specifically identified not with any kind of material analysis, that it simply was a product of the Enlightenment, that you wanted to have people talking about how are ideas generated. And if you're a French person, you know English doesn't really exist. All your view of the world has this sort of French structure to it, so it just makes perfect sense in French, less sense in English. But similarly in German. So anyway, the point being, of course, the idealism of ideology is not the only ground of complaint. It's crucial to realize that the only work of Tracy, which Marx cited, and probably the only one he ever read, was the 1926 edition of the fourth volume of the Elements of Ideology, etc. Or, it's vis-a-vis Tracy's treatise on activity, or as the 23 volume edition entitled the Treatise on Political Economy. Certainly Marx invented the Hegelian dialectic of reason in history into dialectical materialism, in which the mode of production and class conflict determine consciousness. But Marx inherited the word ideology, not from Hegel, who used the word once in reference to the French ideologists, and therefore cannot be strictly speaking credited with an explicit theory of ideology, but only from the cumulative usages current in the in the 1830s and 1840s, specifically from Tracy. And so it's an interesting idea, and Higginbottom never mentions ideology, certainly. What he does take from the Tracy is the idea of production and productive labor and unproductive labor, and uses it to support his critique of Adam Smith. So that's kind of more useful because it makes a little bit more sense, because it resembles, with all due respect, the emphasis on political economy, the material elements that the physiocrats, it gives a little bit more basis to what the physiocrats were trying to do in a sort of mechanical way. In this way, you can talk a little bit more about the details of the differences that are identified in the physiocrat's case. So, and also what Higginbottom is doing here is a slight critique of David Harvey. So that's that. All right. I think I'm at the end of all the yammering. Do you have questions? Why does he not step aside to reflect on this? Well, I think that's just simply, Larry, I think that's just because, well, he does that elsewhere, number one. And, it's simply probably a product of simply all these manuscripts where he's sort of scribbling this stuff down, and, I dealt with it somewhere else, and, moves on. So I would just say that, I'm not trying to apologize for him. I just think that it's just math. I mean, it's just algebra. Invisible hand. Well, the invisible hand is an interesting question, and that's a whole other set of literature and something I am also working on. But that's its own stupid set of ideas that has been unfortunately distorted through history.
It's like another set of dogma.
Well, it's yes. I mean, it's like propaganda or ideology that just the market works. We have trade, stuff happens. The market just works. No, it doesn't work. It doesn't damn work, and we can see it every damn day. Your point of view about it's just a delusion to say that it does work, and that's exactly what Marx is doing about Adam Smith and Ricardo. Is that you guys didn't go far enough, and that's kind of Marx's critique. It says, like, you guys, the world is not quite like that. I mean, it's just not. I mean, that's kind of what he's always he's got his buddy who runs the factory and who actually, you can sort of actually see stuff going on. Whereas people like Smith or Ricardo, they go to their club, they come back, they don't spend any time in a factory. I mean, they spend a little time in the factory. That's why Smith gets his division of labor thing. Well, yeah, the pin goes here, and X number of people come to pin, and blah blah blah.
Well, yeah, I mean that he sort of geared the, I guess, Vol.I more towards the layman.
Yeah,
That
it's like like his pamphleteering, right? He writes these little things, and they make perfect sense. But on the other hand, he knows, well, I'm going to have to explain how this works, and that's kind of what capital does. It tries to work through the stuff.
okay, yeah. I guess I didn't really see it sort of as that way, but that makes sense now, of course.
I mean, it's demonized, right? Everyone said, well, you read Das Kapital, you're going to turn into a commie. But, none. That just doesn't happen.
Right.
Uh, but it's one of the first on the bonfire. I mean, the real danger are these pamphlets. I mean, all of these little shorter things have all the kind of the meat, the things that, you can get pissed off at, and he gets pissed off at, and he makes fun of people, and blah blah blah, all this kind of wilder stuff. The journalism, whatever you call it, propaganda. That makes sense.
Yeah, that helps.
I mean, if you're an academic, you want to say, well, there are magnum opuses here somewhere. And it's sort of a magnum opus, but it's fragmentary. And yet, entire, systems of government have been built on this, however badly, like Lenin.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I consider myself a layman, and when I first kind of came across this surplus value thing, I was like, that's fucking stealing, man. And I think a lot of people would get that.
I think what people should just understand it's not mystical. It just is built into the system. It does what it does, and it does a good job of it. With all due
Yeah,
respect, it's
yeah,
just that there's a moment at which it kind of other people take advantage of it. It gets abused at some moment.
yeah,
And it affects people's belief systems. People's belief systems have that same thing. And Marx is talking about it. It's like ruling class people act a different way, and you sort of have to deal with it. And Marx is also thinking, well, he sort of comes from the ruling class as well, or he's kind of a member of the PMC. So there's always this kind of residual class guilt going on.
I had this image of the plane flying and trying to be repaired while it's flying, and then Anna had that reference to the Twilight Zone, and I'm thinking of, it's like there's this, the economy is this big plane, and then all the gremlins are like the capitalists, like trying to take it down.
Oh yeah, yes, true, absolutely. I mean, some of them are not operating with true, they're not fully aware that they're doing what they're doing.
Right? Yeah, yeah.
Often
They're just doing their gremlin thing, but
yeah, it's just functional. It's just like, just do what we do. And it is that consciousness question that needs to be raised. People think, oh, the longshoremen got a raise from $20 an hour to $63 or $38 an hour to $63 an hour over 5 years or whatever the hell it is. When you consider what they actually do, that kind of it's worth it. And particularly considering how much more, and aside from the rhetoric, how much more automated the entire system is, right? All longshoremen work, ultimately can be done by robots. I mean, it's not that we want it to, but the reality is it'll probably have to be done by robots.
yeah.
And it's not going to be American robots versus Chinese robots. It's just going to be robots. They're not going to
Right, yeah. Tech overlord robots.
but that's kind of what how they phrase their argument, is that they want to stop automation because people's jobs are at stake. Well, for one generation they are, but for the next generation, there's just not going to be jobs.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, there'll be Chinese robots, but they won't have little slanty eyes or whatever. It's just they're just going to be robots. God, get over it. No, the reality, of course, is that at a certain level of production, there are all these Asian workers who don't even get close to $38 an hour who are working on docks in Singapore. And that has to be dealt with. That's a whole other thing.
Well, yeah, that's what I was getting from that AI podcast I was listening to this morning, that, a lot of this AI, is billed as, you know, replacing workers, but what they have actually is people have to do the work of looking at each image to say, does it fit the language model or not? And then, so it's actually people doing the work.
Oh yeah, that's what Elon Musk discovered when he tried to fully automate his Tesla factory.
So you can like automate certain parts, but not everything.
The parts are there, but at some moment, and this is the same problem of the 19th century. In the 19th century, it was still people. Still needed people to mind the machines. The machines weren't going to do it all themselves. You still needed people to, connect all this stuff together and move one thing to another thing. And that's what Adam Smith ignores in his own descriptions of that kind of activity, which is problematic.
As dogma overlooks, right?
I mean, if you're not thinking about working people, it looks like a great thing. Well, the system is we've divided assembly processes to look like this, and but the reality now is, of course, what's his name? The head of the UAW was just on the tube talking about, well, we need to kill NAFTA, and I agree, we sort of need to kill NAFTA, but it's not for the same reasons you're talking about. That is that, at one level, production was backshifted to Mexico, but the reality is it's not Mexico. It goes to a whole bunch of other things that things are assembled in Mexico, but the production process is much wider and longer than that, and it really is simply about wages. And yes, we agree that if you make them more equitable, and that's one of the critiques of the NAFTA 2.0, is that it doesn't actually, it's not very fair to workers in either Canada or Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
It just adds a few more rules, and that's pretty much the difference between the Trumpian version of NAFTA and NAFTA. They're both
So it's like not much better.
Well, they're just, it's just, well, for Trump, it's just rebranding, where he tries to take away the Clintonian implication of NAFTA and replace it with his own stupidity. But anyway. Oh, it's like YMCA. As an American, I always think Americans are so doltish about certain things. Oh, it's just like YMCA. That's how you can remember it. It's the USMCA, Mexico, Canada, and America, MCA, right?
It's got an acronym.
I am so glad that we're almost to the end of Trumpism. Okay, so aside from my yammering here, I will, as